The telephone was already ringing when Dean Martin stepped out of the shower that Saturday afternoon, but he let it ring. He figured it was Frank wanting to talk about some casino gig or maybe one of his ex-wives asking about a check. He wrapped the towel around his waist, walked past the phone, and poured himself a glass of apple juice. The ringing stopped. And wait, because that unanswered call would haunt him for the rest of his life, replaying in his mind like a skipping record during every sleepless night that followed. Years later, he would lie awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, wondering what would have changed if he had picked up 3 seconds earlier. The date was March 21st, 1987. Beverly Hills was bathed in California sunshine, the kind of golden afternoon light that makes everything look like a postcard, the kind of light that promises nothing bad could ever happen. But 60 miles east, in the San Bernardino Mountains, a monster was forming. A freak snowstorm had wrapped itself around Mount San Gorgonio, turning the highest peak in Southern California into a wall of white fury. Visibility dropped to zero. Wind screamed at 60 miles per hour, bending trees sideways and erasing the horizon completely. And somewhere in that chaos, climbing through clouds that had become a death trap, an F-4C Phantom jet was carrying Captain Dean Paul Martin toward a granite wall he would never see. As you listen to this part, I'd appreciate knowing where you are and what time it is for you. I read and replied to every message. Dean dried his hair slowly, completely unaware that his world had exactly 47 minutes left of being whole. He thought about dinner. Maybe La Familia tonight, his usual corner table by the window where the waiters knew to bring his wine without asking. He thought about calling Dino later, just to hear his voice, just to hear that laugh that sounded so much like his own. But there was time for that. There was always time. That's what he told himself as he hung up the towel. Notice how we always assume tomorrow is guaranteed until the moment it isn't. Notice how we treat phone calls like obligations instead of the gifts they actually are. The bond between Dean Martin and his son wasn't something you could see in photographs or read about in magazines. It lived in the small moments, the ones that happened when no cameras were around and no reporters were watching. It lived in the way Dean's eyes would light up whenever Dino walked into a room, the way his whole posture would change, shoulders dropping, smile widening, walls crumbling into nothing. It lived in the way his voice would soften when he talked about his boy to anyone who would listen. "That's my captain," he would say, pointing to a picture of Dino in his flight suit, that green jumpsuit with the patches and the flag. "He flies jets. I just sing songs." It wasn't false modesty. Dean genuinely believed his son had surpassed him in every way. That mattered. Dino was everything Dean had dreamed of becoming when he was a poor kid in Steubenville, Ohio, hustling cards in back rooms and shining shoes on street corners just to survive another day. Handsome in that effortless way that couldn't be taught or bought. Talented in ways that went beyond genetics. Brave in ways that made Dean's heart swell and break at the same time. A tennis player good enough for Wimbledon. An actor with real screen presence who held his own in every scene. A musician who had tasted fame with Dino, Desi, and Billy, touring with screaming fans and sold-out shows. But more than any of that, Dino was a fighter pilot, a captain in the California Air National Guard who strapped himself into machines that could break the sound barrier. While Dean played a drunk on television, stumbling for laughs, his son was defending the country. The pride Dean felt was almost too big to contain in his chest. But here's the part you really need to notice. Dean Martin, the man who kept the whole world at arm's length, who built walls of cool so high that even Frank Sinatra couldn't always climb them, who could fill a room with charm while revealing absolutely nothing of himself, had no walls when it came to Dino. None. Zero. His son was the one person who saw the real man behind the tuxedo, the frightened kid from Ohio who still couldn't believe his luck, the father who loved so deeply it terrified him. When they played golf together, walking the fairways in comfortable silence, when they shared a meal and talked about nothing important, when they just sat watching a game on television, Dean felt whole. Dino was his anchor, his validation, his proof that he had done something right in a life full of lucky breaks and narrow escapes. At 1:47 that afternoon, while Dean was probably settling into his favorite chair with the newspaper, Dino's Phantom jet took off from March Air Force Base on what was supposed to be a routine training mission. His weapons systems officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz, sat behind him in the tandem cockpit. The flight plan was simple, almost boring in its familiarity. A departure procedure that would take them up through the cloud layer and out toward the desert. They had done it dozens of times before. The pre-flight checks were complete. The instruments showed green across the board. Everything was normal. But today the mountain was waiting with patience that granite learns over millennia. Listen to what happened next, because the sequence of events lasted less than 5 minutes but changed everything forever. At 1:52, Dino requested a left turn from air traffic control to avoid a towering mass of clouds directly in their path. The controller approved the turn without hesitation. In the cockpit, the instrument lights would have been glowing softly, the hum of the twin engines a constant reassurance. Dino would have been scanning his gauges, trusting his training, trusting the machine that had never failed him. The clouds outside were so thick that the world had become a featureless white void. No horizon, no reference points, no up or down or sideways, just instruments and instinct, and in that void something went wrong. The jet didn't turn away from the mountain. It turned directly into 11,000 feet of granite and ice. The impact happened at over 400 miles per hour. There was no time to eject, no time to radio a mayday, no time to be afraid, no time for a final thought or a final prayer or a final anything. One moment they were flying. The next, the granite face of San Gorgonio swallowed them whole. The explosion would have been massive, a fireball against gray rock, but the storm muffled it completely. The snow absorbed the sound, absorbed the light, absorbed the secret. The mountain kept what it had taken and told no one. Back in Beverly Hills, the phone rang again. The sound cut through the quiet house like a knife through silk. Dean was in his living room now, maybe flipping channels, maybe reading the sports section, the newspaper spread across his lap. The sun was still shining through his windows, casting rectangles of gold across the expensive carpet. His world was still intact. He picked up the phone this time, expecting Frank's voice, expecting a joke, expecting anything but what came next. The voice on the other end was official, calm, military calm, the kind of calm that carries catastrophe in every syllable. "Mr. Martin, this is the California Air National Guard. Your son's aircraft is missing." Wait, because that word missing is the cruelest word in the English language. It offers hope while carrying doom in its back pocket. It freezes time. It turns minutes into hours and hours into eternities. It leaves you suspended between worlds, unable to grieve, unable to hope, unable to do anything but wait and imagine and pray. Dean didn't scream. He didn't drop the phone. He simply stopped breathing for a moment, his hand gripping the receiver so hard his knuckles went white, the bones showing through the skin. "What do you mean, missing?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, barely recognizable as his own. They explained. The storm, the lost radar contact, the search teams that couldn't fly because the weather was too severe, the visibility too low, the winds too violent. They told him to wait. They told him they would call back as soon as they knew anything. They told him not to lose hope. But Dean heard none of it. All he heard was the static between their words, the empty space where his son's voice should have been, the silence that had already begun to swallow him. The next 3 days were the longest of Dean Martin's life, 72 hours that felt like 72 years. The storm refused to break. Helicopters sat grounded on tarmacs, their pilots pacing and cursing the weather that wouldn't quit. Search parties were turned back by avalanches and zero visibility, the mountain refusing to reveal its secret. The peak had become a fortress, and somewhere inside it, Dino was waiting. Or not waiting. Dean didn't know. That was the torture. The not knowing was worse than knowing the worst. He stopped eating. Food tasted like cardboard, like ash. He stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mountain, saw his son's face smiling from a photograph that now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. He chain-smoked until the air in his living room turned blue with haze. He sat by the telephone, staring at it like it was an oracle, willing it to ring with good news. He imagined scenarios, each one more desperate than the last. Maybe Dino had ejected. Maybe he was huddled under his parachute on some ledge, cold but alive, cursing the weather and waiting for rescue. Maybe he was building a snow shelter, remembering his survival training. Dean clung to these fantasies like a drowning man clings to driftwood, knowing they were probably lies, needing them anyway. Remember this image because it matters more than any movie scene or stage performance or comedy routine. The king of cool, the man who made the whole world laugh, sitting in his pajamas at 3 a.m, trembling, praying prayers he hadn't said since childhood, since his mother taught him to kneel beside his bed in that cramped house in Steubenville. "Take everything," he whispered to a God he wasn't sure was listening. "Take the money, take the fame, take it all. Take the houses and the cars and the records. Just give me the boy. Please, just give me the boy." Frank called. His voice was uncharacteristically gentle, stripped of all swagger. Sammy called. Jerry Lewis called. Dean barely spoke to any of them. What was there to say? His friends offered comfort, but comfort was useless. Words were useless. Everything was useless. Only one thing could help him now, and that one thing was trapped on a mountain wrapped in snow. On the third day, the weather finally broke. The helicopters lifted off at dawn, their rotors cutting through air that was suddenly, cruelly clear. They found the scar on the granite face within hours, a black mark against gray stone. They found the wreckage scattered across the slope. They found the truth that Dean had been dreading for 72 hours of sleepless torment. There was no parachute. There were no survivors. There was nothing left but twisted metal and silence. When the phone rang with the confirmation, Dean listened without speaking. He thanked the officer in a voice that didn't sound like his own. He hung up, and then something inside him simply collapsed, like a building imploding in slow motion, floor after floor falling into dust. The light in his eyes, that mischievous twinkle that had charmed the world for 4 decades, flickered once and went dark. It would never return. But here's the part most people never understood about what happened next. Dean Martin didn't die on March 21st, 1987. His heart kept beating. His lungs kept breathing. He continued to exist in the technical sense for another 8 years. But the man who lived in that body, the man who laughed, who loved, who lit up every room he entered, that man was buried on the mountainside with his son. What remained was a ghost, a shell going through the motions of a life that no longer had any meaning, any purpose, any point. The funeral was a blur of black limousines and weeping celebrities, military honors rendered with precision, a folded American flag presented with white-gloved hands, the sound of taps echoing across the cemetery like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Dean wore dark glasses not for style, not for the cameras, but to hide eyes that had become dead and swollen from crying, from not sleeping, from staring at phones that rang with the wrong news. He moved like a sleepwalker through the receiving line, accepting condolences he couldn't hear, shaking hands he couldn't feel. At the graveside, he reached out and touched the casket, a gentle touch, almost tender, like he was tucking his boy in for the last time. Witnesses say he whispered something, but no one could hear what. Maybe I love you. Maybe wait for me. Maybe something only a father could say to a son he would never see again. Listen to how the years unfolded after that day, because they tell you everything about what grief can do to a man. Dean retreated into his Beverly Hills home and essentially never came back out. He stopped returning calls. He stopped accepting roles. He stopped caring about the empire he had built. When Frank Sinatra organized a reunion tour in 1988, dragging Dean back on stage for one last ride with the Rat Pack, it was a disaster from the first night. Dean stood under the lights in Oakland and Chicago and Vancouver, and he looked lost. He forgot lyrics he had sung 1,000 times. He mumbled through songs that used to flow like water. He stared at the audience with eyes that couldn't quite focus. In Chicago, he turned to Frank mid-show and said the words that ended an era. I want to go home. He flew back to Los Angeles that night and never performed again. The official story was kidney problems. The real story was a soul problem. He had tried to be Dean Martin one more time for his friends, and the mask simply wouldn't stay on anymore. Notice how he spent his final years. Every evening, Dean would put on a tuxedo or a sport coat, dressing for dinner out of habit and self-respect. He would drive to his favorite Italian restaurant, sit at the same table, eat his pasta slowly, sip his wine, and stare into the middle distance. The staff knew not to bother him. Fans who approached found him polite but vacant, present in body but absent in every way that mattered, and there was always an extra place setting at his table, an empty chair across from him, a glass of wine that was never touched. Some people thought he was waiting for Frank. Others thought he was waiting for a woman. But those who really knew him understood. That chair was for Dino. Dean was having dinner with his son, continuing conversations that only he could hear. He told a friend once late at night, I'm not afraid of dying. Why should I be? Everyone I love is already there. Christmas Day, 1995. 8 years, 9 months, and 4 days after the phone first rang with the news, Dean Martin lay in his bed, breathing shallow, lungs ravaged by cigarettes and a heart ravaged by something no doctor could treat. Outside, the world was celebrating. Families were opening presents. Carols were playing on every radio station, some of them his own recordings, his voice filling living rooms while he lay dying alone. The end came quietly. No struggle. No fear. Just a final exhale. A letting go of the burden he had carried for 8 years. The king of cool closed his eyes, and the silence he had been seeking finally took him. When the news broke, the lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed. Frank Sinatra wept for his brother. The world mourned an icon, but for those who truly knew Dean, there was relief. He wasn't suffering anymore. Somewhere beyond the clouds, a pilot had finally landed, and a father was waiting at the gate. The tragedy of Dean Martin's life is that he spent 40 years making us laugh while his story ended in tears. But in that tragedy lives a truth that matters more than any song. Fame is nothing. Money is dust. The only thing powerful enough to break a man like Dean Martin is love. He loved his son so completely that he couldn't survive without him. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. So the next time you hear that voice crooning about amore, remember the father who spent his last years talking to an empty chair. Remember the pilot who never came home and the king who followed him into the sky. Rest in peace, Dino. Both of them. They're together now, beyond the clouds, laughing again.